right, welcome back, everyone. So on behalf of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project at the University of Washington-Tacoma, I'd like to welcome everyone back to today's installment of our fall seminar series, Making Trouble. And today it's an absolute honor to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Cal Winslow, who's joining us to share his recent book, Radical Seattle, The General Strike of 1919, which was published this year by Monthly Review Press. Dr. Winslow is a social historian, an author, a labor activist, an environmentalist, and the current director of the Mendocino Institute. He's a former fellow in environmental history at the University of California, Berkeley. He was trained at Antioch College and Warwick University, where he studied under the direction of the late E.P. Thompson. Yes, the making of the English working class, E.P. Thompson. Dr. Winslow is the author of several award-winning books covering an incredible breadth of topics, from regional politics of California to a study of crime and society in late 18th century England. In addition to these scholarly endeavors, he's worked as a warehouseman, a truck driver, a journalist, and a participant and observer in the 1970s rank and file workers' rebellion in the US. His most recent book is Radical Seattle, The General Strike of 1919. And that explores the role the radical left played in shaping the people and the politics of the Pacific Northwest. And reading this book over the summer, 100 years ago from the history that it chronicles, I was just, repeatedly struck by really the uncanny similarities that connect our present moment in this history. We've got, a pandemic, the emergence of a nascent political left, reactionary conservative journalism, xenophobic nativism, racial and ethnic tensions that are still 100 years later far from resolved. I could be describing 2020, but these are all factors at play in the history Cal illuminates in this amazing new book. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cal Winslow to our seminar. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your time, experience, and your expertise. We spoke beforehand. Cal is going to talk for maybe 20 minutes, half an hour. And as always, if you have questions during the presentation portion of today's seminar, just go ahead and type them into the chat room, and we'll do our best to save plenty of time for Q&A. So again, thank you so much, Cal, for joining us.
And thank you, Alex, for the very kind words. This is a great story. I just hope I can live up to saying something about it in this short amount of time that I have. So let me just start with this, and I'll try to be brief. So here we are, February 6, 1919. 60,000 workers have shut down Seattle. Nothing, it was said, moved but the tide. It was an extraordinary time, unique. So 110 unions, all affiliated with the American Federation of Labor, joined in the nation's first real general strike. Nothing like it had quite happened before, and nothing afterwards. Seattle's workers ran the city. The authorities stood by, hopeless. The workers not only fed the people, they saw to it that that the children got milk, that the garbage was picked up. They saw to it that the hospitals remained running, and they kept the peace. Workers armed only with armbands walked the streets. Crime, by all accounts, abated. So there's much to say here, but I'd like to begin with two questions. The first is, why did this strike happen in Seattle and nowhere else? And the second is, why did radicalism persist in the aftermath of the strike? So let's look at two currents. They're separate, but increasingly interconnected in the labor movement of the Puget Sound country. The first, and this may well be known to you all, highlights the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And for our sake here, we'll just mention the 1907 Spokane free speech movement, which electrified the country, really. Secondly, the 1916 Everett catastrophe, which horrified the working classes of the Northwest. 1917, the general strike in the woods, led by the IWW, some 50,000 loggers and mill workers on strike. So we have this as part of our background. And in saying this, though, I should add that these are not just scattered movements and strikes. The IWW had its base in Seattle. The Industrial Worker, their Western paper, was published in Seattle. The Verona and the Callista sailed to Everett from Seattle. And then IWW members were scattered throughout Seattle's workforce, often as two-card men, one card, a union card, one card for the job, one card for the principal. Now, this is extraordinary, really, to think about. It was anathema to the leaders of the American Federation of Labor, but it underscores what becomes an extraordinary amount of solidarity within the working class in the Seattle movement. So another point, Seattle in 1919 was a modern industrial city with a diversified economy, even as its shipyards became to dominate the economy in the war years. Elliott Bay was the premier port on the coast. It was the gateway to Alaska. It was 2 days closer to Asia than San Francisco, its rival to the south. And from the Palouse, vast amounts of wheat were shipped all over the world. Now, Seattle's labor movement grew rapidly in these years, and it was a labor movement led by left-wing socialists. Socialists, interestingly enough, socialists who believed in industrial unionism as opposed to craft unionism. That is, that all workers in a particular industry should be in the same union rather than a union movement organized by the job. So they believed in industrial unionism from the get-go. The best known advocate of industrial unionism was actually the president of the Seattle Central Labor Council, and that was a man named Jimmy Duncan. And the form of industrial unionism at that point in Seattle was called Duncanism after him. And it was a label given to a centralized labor movement committed to the closed shop and more than willing to use the sympathy strike to achieve that, the closed shop. And in these years, this is in stark contrast to what the employers wanted, which was called the American shop or the open shop, or effectively no union shop at all. Jimmy Duncan was a left-wing socialist, not a member of the Socialist Party, but sympathetic to it, and quite tolerant of the IWW at a time when, on a national level, the IWW and the AFL were bitter enemies. He was a supporter of the Russian Revolution of 1917. He was an anti-racist who welcomed Japanese participation in the strike. He opposed the Japanese Land Act, which was to come, and he offered critical support to the IWW in the aftermath of Everett. I should also say here something about Kate Sadler. She was Seattle's best known socialist. She said she learned her socialism on her father's knee in Scotland. Whenever workers fought, our Kate, they called her, she was there. Crystal Eastman, when she was reporting on the Mooney Conference in Chicago, the conference to defend the frame up in San Francisco. Crystal Eastman called her one of Seattle's wild ones. The workers of the Northwest called her our Joan of Arc. We really need to know more about her. So if you have any people looking for theses topics, or people who are willing to really dig, because it's not going to be easy, I give them all the possible encouragement. She died in Tacoma in 1939. Now, in the years 1916 to 1918, Seattle's trade union movement grew by 300%. And it grew in all sectors unevenly. There were actually bloody defeats on the docks in 1916, and of Teamsters in Local 174, which I think still exists, still thrives, in 1915. But there were victories in shipyards and laundries and street cars, with waitresses and telephone operators and foundries and barbers, flour mill workers, and the defeats on the docks and in trucking were ultimately undone. So the trade union movement grew from some 15,000 to some 60,000 in that short period of time. And it also should be noted that these new unions and these new union members could be every bit as radical as the IWW. Quite an important fact of the situation, the period, and something that tells us a lot about what kind of a movement that we're dealing with. So these currents fused in movements to oppose the war, to support the Everett victims, and to support the shipyard workers. And they fused in the shops, but also on the streets of Seattle's notorious Skid Road, where socialist and IWW soapboxers flourished, and where there were thousands of migrant workers and loggers who wintered there. When the rains were at their heaviest, the loggers would leave the woods and come into Seattle, where I'm sure they came into Tacoma as well, and would stay in the flop houses of Skid Row. They were unwelcome anywhere else, and spend their time in the cheap saloons and brothels of an open part of the city. And once again, this was something of considerable importance. The loggers, it might be said, were admired by and described by people like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and also Kate Sadler as essentially homeless young men. I don't know what people might think of loggers, but they had a reputation of being fighters and drunks and so on. But they were, in the words of these tribunes of the time, they were youngsters, young men who would probably never have a family, never have a home to live in, never have anything of what was meant to be the American life in the aftermath of the Great War and all the promises that came along with it for the people who fought in it. So the loggers and other migrants routinely wintered in Seattle. And in this process, class consciousness grew and deepened. In reaction to Everett, and maybe I didn't say, I don't know if we have time, and perhaps you all know about this, but in reaction to Everett, where the boatload, the Verona, which filled with IWW members that sailed into Gardner Bay and Everett in support of striking shingle workers there. The boat was attacked from both sides as it came into the harbor. 6 IWW members at least were killed. Many more were drowned and lost forever as they either fell or went into the waters of the bay, never to be heard from again. This shocked and horrified the IWW, but it also shocked and horrified the people of Seattle. For the ships had sailed from Seattle, as I think I mentioned earlier, and the victims came back on these boats from Seattle, where they were arrested and put into prison. If they were wounded, they went into the hospitals in Seattle to be fixed up and sent to jail. And the trial at which the IWW was exonerated took place in Seattle. And now this is important. So this is important. It's about Everett, but in many ways, it's also a Seattle story because, as I said, it shocked the people of Seattle, who were first shocked. And how could this happen at this point in time? What did it mean about the country that unarmed people were denied even the right to speak, and in a place like Everett? And eventually, I think it made them angry. And it's in that sense that I'm saying that the class consciousness deepened. So in this process, in these years, Seattle's workers, and I think the workers of the Northwest, and here again, there's a lot to be learned from the workers of Tacoma. The strike was in solidarity with striking shipyard workers, and 35,000 shipyard workers were on strike in Seattle, another 15,000 in Tacoma. And the strike was different in Tacoma, but nonetheless extremely interesting. The workers of the Northwest created an infrastructure of radical trade unionism, and by 1919, a consciousness of themselves as a class because of their unions, their co-ops, their political organizations, and they even had a labor-owned daily paper, the Seattle Daily Record, which rivaled the Times and the PI in circulation. That is a labor-owned daily newspaper, which had everything that a newspaper could want to have. It had its international news on the front page, which was extensive, and internationalism is one of the important themes of the developments of this movement. But it also had its advertisement, sports pages, and a women's page, and so on and so forth. So we have this infrastructure that has been created. Now, in the aftermath of the war, in the face of the employer's offensive, that is, it was national, really, and international, and the idea that if labor thought they were going to make advances, so did the employers. And we have the return with a vengeance of the American plan, led especially by the lumbermen in the Northwest. So in the face of that, and in a city still reeling from the Great Flu, thousands of people had died in the Northwest as a result of the misnamed Spanish flu. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? The Chinese flu, we call it. But this flu started out on an army base in Kansas, and so quite properly should have been called the Kansas flu. Anyway, still reeling from the Great Flu, Seattle's workers, with all this behind them, were itching for a fight. And so when striking shipyard workers, so as I said, some 30,000 in Seattle, 15,000 in Tacoma, appealed for support, and they appealed for support because it seemed that especially the government, but also the shipyard owners in league with the government were determined not to live up to wartime promises. Seattle shipyard workers felt that then they had built more ships than any other port in the country. They felt that they were owed rewards for having done that. They lived through a period when what was called the rising cost of living was one of the main issues every place, but no one denied that the cost of living in Seattle was much higher than it was in the rest of the country. So the shipyard workers were on strike because of the cost of living, but also because their leadership, the Metal Trades Council, anticipated the attack of the employers and was encouraged to try to even out the pay scales and the working conditions of the skilled and the unskilled in the yards. The unskilled often made just a fraction of what the skilled workers made, although the unskilled workers were by far the biggest group in the yards. By the way, I might say that it's interesting to note, and more could be found out about this as well, that there were women scattered throughout the shipyards in Seattle, as well as black workers. Now, the national charters of the international unions with which the Seattle unions were affiliated all forbade black membership and women's membership. And so this was one of many places where the Seattle unions had to defy the international unions, and where they were a thorn in the side of the international unions. So where were we? The Seattle's workers then were itching for a fight. And when the metal workers asked the Seattle Central Labor Council for support, the idea of a general strike swept through the ranks, according to the historian Harvey O'Connor, who wrote Revolution in Seattle, a marvelous book which still deserves reading, swept through the ranks like a gale. And a couple words before I finish, and maybe we can have some questions. I began by saying that during the strike, the streets of Seattle were quiet, but and that has been seen as a problem or problematic by many latter-day observers. But the streets were quiet, yes, but not the union halls and not the feeding stations, not the working class neighborhood, and not the places like Georgetown, where raucous, huge rallies were held in the course of the strike. On the Monday night of the strike, thousands of workers crammed into a hall in Georgetown, so many that the hall seemed to be settling, and they had to abandon the hall for another location. And one of the interesting comments that was recorded in the union record was a worker who said that they just ought to be having these rallies all the time, and they ought to be opened up to the community so the wives and the daughters of the workers could be fully apprised of what was happening in events like the strike. So yes, quiet, also no violence, but there were no picket lines, no strike breakers, no arrests, and in the end, no martyrs and no widows and no defense campaigns. No strike breakers is important, because why do you have picket lines? You have picket lines to keep other workers from taking your job. That's the main point, and no one stepped forward to take these jobs in Seattle or in Tacoma or in the coastal towns of Aberdeen and Hoquiam. So the strike was, again, quite amazing in terms of its solidarity. Perhaps 100,000 workers participated in the strike, because this included not only the trade union members, but also unorganized workers, workers who were unemployed, the families of workers. School children came out on strike, including the paper boys, the newspaper boys, who had children who had a union of their own. So I think I mentioned the Japanese workers, their unions, they joined the strike. It was really quite extraordinary. I'm at the end of my time now. I'm not trying to say that everything was perfect here. I'm very well aware of what happened to the indigenous peoples of the Northwest, and how, even though what happened was perhaps not as grotesque as what happened down here in California, the result was much the same. And I'm aware of the fact that the Chinese were driven from Seattle and Tacoma in the 1880s. I'm aware of that, but times had changed, and it's worth considering the developments that came about in the course of the general strike. So the Seattle, the city's unions then, I'm arguing, emerged from the strike hardly beaten, really as strong as ever and ready to fight again. And another indication of this is that the authorities dared not to victimize the strikers or their leaders. There were no arrests. Now, just a side point, no blood. Historians sometimes measure the success or failure of a strike or a movement by the amount of blood in the streets. And the Seattle workers, though, were well aware of the role of provocateurs, and especially the IWW was and had experienced this at every turn, even as its slogan was "arms folded." That was the way that you won a strike. And then too, everyone knew that the Puget Sound country was awash with sailors and soldiers, and above all here in Tacoma at Camp Lewis. So Seattle's workers got milk to the babies, kept the hospitals open, fed the hungry. It was probably the only time that no one went hungry in Seattle. Strike lasted only 5 days, but they were 5 days in my mind that mattered. The strike helped kick off 1919, the year of the great strikes. It inspired workers internationally, and above all, it showed what workers were capable of doing. It showed their ability to organize and their ability to fight. They returned to work, yes, and they returned before many wanted to, yes, but in the words of the official history of the strike, the majority were by and large proud of themselves for the way they had come out on strike, proud of themselves for the way they had kept order under provocation, glad to have gained so much education with so little suffering, glad to have worked shoulder to shoulder with their fellow unionists, and glad that the labor movement in Seattle was still growing strong. Max Eastman, the editor of the important magazine of the Times, The Liberator, in Seattle at the time of the strike, wrote this, and we'll finish with this. General strike in this city of Seattle filled with hope and happiness the hearts of millions of people in all places of the earth. You demonstrated the possibility of that loyal solidarity of the working class, which is the sole remaining hope of the liberty for mankind. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. And again, I want to invite uh, members in the audience here, if you have questions for Cal, I see them popping up already. Go ahead and type them into the chat room. We've got some questions that were submitted by students ahead of time. But again, before we get to that, just a round of digital applause for Cal. Fantastic work. We did have questions. As I receive them, as they come in from students, I generally sort of group them into general themes. And it seems like students were very interested to learn a little bit more about the role that the media played in sort of controlling the narrative, both in favor of sort of an emerging radical class consciousness, but also working to suppress that in both Seattle and in San Francisco, in the 30s. Could you maybe speak a little more about the role that the media played, both leading up to and during the Seattle General Strike, or just the media more generally?
Well, there were three mainstream papers: the Times, the PI, and the Star. I think it's fair to say they were hysterical in the face of the strike. They insisted that it was a revolution, which it wasn't. And the workers certainly knew the difference between a strike and a revolution. But they were hysterical, and they framed it in terms of patriotism and, all the things that you could expect that they would do. The important thing from the point of view of a working class and why Seattle could do what they did, the important thing here is the role of the Seattle Union Record, which really is quite extraordinary, and I wish it could be made available to everyone, but you can go into the library at the University of Washington. Everyone can. And read through it. But to me, one of the things about it was the internationalism of the paper. You would read about the demands of the shipyard workers on the front page, right next to an account of the German Revolution, or right next to what happened to Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. So they were a political newspaper as well as a newspaper which had the form of a regular daily newspaper. So I think that's and the circulation went up to 120,000 in the aftermath of the war. So I don't know if that answers your question. Of course, the IWW, they strictly, had their own paper, the Industrial Worker, which didn't have the size or the scope of the Union Record, but which was a record and a newspaper in which you could hear the voices of ordinary working people. It was full of letters and full of reports from strikes and full of reports from lumber camps and so on. So that was quite good. There had been other socialist papers at this point. In these years overall, virtually every town at one point or another in the Puget Sound country had a socialist newspaper, going right back to the days of the utopian colonies on Puget Sound. So the media is very, very important. And above all, I would say the Union Record was important. It's two leaders, Harry Alt, the publisher, and Anna Louise Strong, were as important as anyone else in the development of the whole movement there. Anna Louise Strong, a young woman, a middle-class woman who came from the Midwest to Seattle and became radicalized as a result of her opposition to the war and serving on the school board from which she was recalled. She became well known for her reporting of the Everett strike for the New York Evening News, and eventually became most probably a member of the IWW. She was she wrote the history of the strike, which was published right after the strike. It's very important in terms of our ability to understand the strike. And unfortunately for all of us, she left for what she thought wrongly would be the greener pastures of the Soviet Union in the middle of the 1920s. But Annalise Strong, an incredibly important figure in this movement.
Excellent, thanks. And it seems like, at least in your retelling of the strike, the the solidarity work stoppage at the Union Record really played a role in the fact that they weren't publishing during the strike actually may have had a negative effect on sort of keeping the striking workers sort of organized during that time, right? Because the other papers continued to publish and sort of control the narrative, right?
Oh, I don't know that I would take it that far. The rank and file workers certainly were unhappy with the fact they looking at it from the other point of view, the strikers wanted no favors for anybody. Do you see, right? And if everybody was going to be on strike, the printers and so forth, that the Union Record should be on strike, and there shouldn't be people working while other people were on strike. Now, the people who worked in the labor temple, had to go on strike. The union officers lost their pay during the course of the strike. Now, all that being said, the rank and file workers were very much angered by the fact that the Union Record had been stopped from publishing and demanded that it publish, and of course it did, and they restarted publication. To the degree that it harmed the strike, I couldn't say.
Okay, we got a number of questions being typed into the chat room here. I wanted to maybe just pan back a little bit and talk about your work as a whole. And I see Zach Patton has asked a really great question here about just kind of your approach to studying history. He writes, as a student of E.P. Thompson, could you talk a little bit about the tradition of history from below or history from the bottom up, and how this perspective informs your writing? And then what can students and activists take from this tradition, and how they read, how they write, and how they make their own history today?
Changing. One of the things that I really wanted to do was to tell the story of the strike as much as I could in the words of the strikers themselves, in the words of the workers of this period of time. And in a sense, that's much of what history from below is really all about. That for most of time, and mostly today, we don't get authentic voices from the parts of society where the people who do the work live and work. So I think that's an important part of history from below. Albion's fatal tree is interesting, I think, because we used, of the records that we used to find the voices of working people in the 18th century, which it was even more difficult to find those voices now. So I think that would be one thing that someone doing research, or someone you might think about, is that your source material, what is it, where does it come from? One of the problems of the Friedlander book is that he relies so much on the testimony of the infiltrators and the police agents and so forth who were involved in the strike. And that takes place everywhere, because it's quite common for historians to want to go to the archives in Washington, D.C., and you can go to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and find out all kinds of information. But a lot of times these spies couldn't tell the difference between the IWW and the Socialist Party. So they're hostile to these people. I included in the book some statements from the lumber mill men about what they thought of the workers in their mills and yards. So that is, I don't know if that's completely the answer, but I think that's part of it. The other another thing about Thompson's method was that one had to take into consideration the experience of people, for better or worse, their own experiences. And so in terms of framing this book, I tried to think about, well, what would the experience of a conscious worker, or a worker becoming conscious, what would it have been in 1917 and by 1918, when all these things were coming together, war and influenza and employers' attack. So that's some of it, I think.
Excellent. Yeah, we spoke before everybody else joined us in the room about just sort of the writing of the book and how vivid some of the descriptions are. And as you're sort of explaining this, I'm reminded of just how often those descriptions of what happened came from the people that lived those experiences. And you can get that kind of visceral experience of history through the eyes of the people who actually experienced it. And that kind of leads me to another question that came in and sort of various iterations about the leveraging of sort of state-sanctioned violence against labor uprisings. So again, I had the students in this course read an essay attached to the general strike, but then they also read an essay about the San Francisco general strike. And many of them were struck by the differences between the two events, and then sort of looping in the Everett massacre and Centralia, just how coordinated some of these attacks on labor were. And they were curious to know, whether that relationship between sort of capital and the state has evolved, or has it remained consistent, in your opinion, over the years?
Well, I'm afraid probably we're quite jaded today when we think of Wesley Everett being murdered in Centralia. We have in our streets, people being tortured and shot by police right and left. And the Everett situation was extreme, but one can imagine that there are plenty of people amongst us today who would be quite happy to see Black Lives Matter dealt with in a similar way. So, the workers couldn't control the reaction of the authorities. And what's interesting about Seattle is that how far that they could go without provoking violence on the part of the authorities. The way I put it was that the police really just had to kind of stand by. What were they going to do? Were they going to go into people's homes and drag them out? I suppose they could have, but they're dealing with the majority of the people of a pretty big city. And the generals, it seemed to me, they hesitated. Were they to attack a peaceful city? Now that may not have lasted forever. Another thing that we have to say about the strike in terms of people going back when they did was that by the fourth and fifth days of the strikers looked around, and outside of Seattle and Tacoma, no one else was coming out in solidarity with them. Not in California, not in the hard rock mines of the Rockies, not in the Midwest. They were pretty much on their own. So that's something else I think that really was a factor. On the other hand, I think it's, for myself, it's very interesting to consider the fact that this could have been done, even partially, without violence.
I do. I totally agree. And that sort of gets at, and I have so many questions that were submitted ahead of time that I and attempting to sort of lessons from 1919 and up to 2020. And I think that notion of well, one of the questions that just came into that room is about the sedition of 1818 and how just historically any kind of sort of radical, progressive or left thought has been positioned as first and foremost anti-American or unpatriotic. Is there a way that sort of the left can sort of reclaim that narrative and sort of get back to sort of connotatively link progressives, pro-worker policies with this notion of what it means to be American, or what it means to live in a country like America? Or is that ship sailed at this point?
That's a rough one, and you're breaking up on me. Am I breaking up on you? I've lost you, I think.
Sorry about that.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I apologize. I have 3 children downstairs who are all homeschooling right now, so they may be chipping into the bandwidth of the house.
Yeah, so I'm not clear really on your question. The one thing about the Red Scare is that in another important book by William Preston, called Aliens and Dissenters, he shows how really the roots of the Red Scare and the Palmer raids were in the Northwest in this period of time, where especially the lumbermen of Eastern Washington had been howling for federal support for soldiers for half a decade, where they felt that they were basically not able to cope with the IWW and others, and wanted troops. They wanted federal troops. And the other thing was partially because once you get federal troops involved, and I suppose this is what Trump's thinking, you don't need to have trials. You don't, right? You don't need to go through any of that, which they were also concerned about, the cost of keeping the jails going, the time involved in trials and interrogations and all of that. So that was important. The second thing was that even though that this was, of course, Seattle was, as much as any other place, filled with immigrants, often from Northern Europe. By 1918, 1919, they had decided that it wasn't the German immigrant who was the problem. It was immigrants in general, because they were all anarchists and so forth. And so the IWW switched from being in this line of thinking a German organization to being an organization of immigrants, which it wasn't. All the studies of the IWW, I think, in the West show that to be mostly the case. So in 1918, they rounded up, it's horrific, really. They rounded up all the immigrants that they could find. I wrote about this to a bit about a group of Italian immigrants who were thrown onto a locked train and sent to New York City to be tried there. People who, as far as anyone could see, had no connection to the IWW at all. So that certainly was a factor. And if what you were asking me when I couldn't quite follow it all was the comparisons to today, sure, it's just, it makes your stomach turn, just like the situation on our southern border down here makes one's stomach turn. And the idea of the bans on people coming in, I'm sure you and your students don't need to be told about that.
Excellent. Yeah, do you have time for one more question?
I'm okay. The dogs aren't barking. I'm happy.
Nice. I don't want to keep people too long, but the question of what endures comes up in your piece, Company Town, this idea of the ghosts of Seattle's rebel past. And again, I think this may be speaking to the anxieties that all of us are feeling right now. But students were curious to know, what does endure of that revolutionary past? Do you see opportunities for mass movements of the size and style and scale of the early decades of the 20th century? Do you have reason for any of us to be hopeful moving forward?
Well, I'm not one who believes in kind of finding lessons every place in history, but I think of the importance of the Seattle story mainly in terms of its ability to inspire us. It's such a great story that we should read about it and just feel all that much better and stronger about whatever it is that we're doing. Now, we have plenty of very large movements, and we have, in my lifetime in this country. One of the things I tried to emphasize, and maybe speaking as someone who was involved in the 60s as well, one of the things which one wonders about is this, that in the 1910s, there was a process of building that went on in and year out. The Seattle general strike did not come from out of the blue, as we might say. It didn't come out of it because a group of wobblies on the outskirts of the movement said, "Hey, we need a general strike," and they were saying, "Hey, we need a general strike all the time," but that didn't mean that they ever had one. So I think that that's one thing that I would really think about, and even thinking about the 1960s, when I was at the university for a couple of years, the movement was built, year in and year out, and not everything was always so happy, but it was people kept at it. Of course, the war didn't go away, but so people had to keep at it, and there were years of coming back and starting again. Talking to people about the war, explaining to them what the war was all about, and that's one of the things that that I'm most proud of in my own life, was the ability to help change a significant number of people's ideas about the war in Vietnam, and to be part of undermining that war.
Well, thank you so much. And I think the work itself, your writing over the years has been incredibly transformative, at least to me. And so I will do my best to have as many students as possible check out this most recent book and all of your work. Thank you so much for coming in today and sharing your time and your expertise.
Alex, if you can hear me, you're off again, but if you can hear me, no, I should be thanking you, and I should be thanking the students who took time to come and listen to me. I hope that they'll have a chance to get a copy of the book and read it. But it's really been it's been my pleasure, and thank you very much. And thanks to your colleagues and the students.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks again. Sorry about the computer problems today, but this was again just another fantastic talk. So next Monday, we're going to have a group of former faculty members from St. Martin's talk about their attempt to organize their workplace, women of color organizing. It should be fantastic. So be sure to stay tuned for that. Everybody have a fantastic week. And oh, I see the question. Radical Seattle, the General Strike of 1919 is the title of Cal's book. Excellent. Well, thanks again for joining us.